Good evening. My name is Kalman Weiser. I'm the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies and Director of York University's Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you tonight to our event, the launch of a special volume of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes, dedicated to the subject of Jewish education. This is a sizable volume with fresh insights by scholars working in the fields of both Jewish education and Canadian Jewish studies from multiple disciplinary angles. While work on the issue began prior to the 7th of October 2023, it could not arrive at a more important time. The necessity of Jewish education to prepare the grounds for the future has been made all the more apparent by the painful challenges of our present moment. The Koschitzky Center is extremely proud to be hosting this event as leaders in the fields of Canadian Jewish studies. The center is not only the administrative home of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and the journal Canadian Jewish Studies. The journal's editor-in-chief is our colleague, Professor David Kaufman, the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. We'll be hearing from him later. First, however, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Joshua Tapper, the journal's managing editor. Joshua Tapper is a doctoral candidate in Jewish history at Stanford University, where he is completing a dissertation about Jewish society and politics in the final years of the Soviet Union. He is a graduate of the University of Toronto and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. His writing on global Jewish affairs and on other subjects has appeared in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Jewish Daily Forward, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, and the Toronto Star, among other publications. His scholarship on Soviet Jewish migration to and resettlement in Canada has been published in the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, where he currently works as managing editor, and he serves as co-vice president of its parent organization, the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Joshua?
Okay, well, thank you, Kalman, for that warm introduction. I too am very excited to be here in celebration of Canadian Jewish Studies 38, a special volume on Jewish education in Canada, which I have here. The conception of this volume goes back a few years and actually predates my tenure as managing editor of CJS. But having been around for the solicitation of articles, the commissioning of work, and all stages of the publication pipeline that followed, it gives me a great deal of pleasure, perhaps a bit of relief, to share this work, which I think we all hope leads to further scholarly engagement with the topic of Jewish education and its many dimensions here in Canada. As Kalman said, it's an incredibly rich and multifaceted volume featuring scholars and practitioners at various stages of their careers. And I think as a whole, truly accomplishes one of the things that Canadian Jewish Studies values so greatly, and that is multidisciplinarity. And so I hope you all get a sense of that as our conversation unfolds this evening. As I'm sure everyone in the audience can imagine, completing a volume like this, completing any journal volume is a group effort. So in addition to David Kaufman, our special editors, who I'll introduce in a moment, our contributors, I'd like to give a shout out to Canadian Jewish Studies Associate Editors, Amir Levy, Valentina Gotti, Vardit Lightstone, and Janice Rosen for their diligent and reliably excellent work. So we have an exciting program this evening, which will unfold in three parts. First, we're delighted to have our three special editors here for a discussion about the volume, its animating themes, and the methods behind their madness. We'll speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're thrilled to be able to introduce several of our contributors who we've asked to tease their pieces with the hope that they'll encourage all of you watching to go and read them in their entirety. And David Kaufman is posting in the chat the link to our website where you can find all of the contributions free to read. Um, After the contributors speak, we'll open up to audience Q&A and discussion with all of the special editors and contributors. And so as a reminder, you can submit questions or comments for any of the editors, any of the contributors, at any point in the program by using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Okay, so without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our three special editors. First, Laura Wiseman holds degrees from McGill University, the Hebrew University, and the University of Toronto, where she earned a PhD in Hebrew language and literature. She worked at United Synagogue Day Schools in Toronto for more than 2 decades in a variety of roles, including vice principal, principal, and director of Jewish studies across the school's 3 campuses. She also worked at Toronto's Board of Jewish Education, and taught Tanakh at the Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto. She is currently a professor of education and humanities at York, where she serves as the Koschitzky Family Chair in Jewish Teacher Education. And Laura, I invite you now to turn on your video and join me on screen. Next, we have Daniel Held. Daniel is the Chief Program Officer at UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, responsible for the organization's strategy to strengthen the vibrancy and vitality of Jewish Toronto. He previously served as executive director of UJA's Julia and Henry Koschitzky Center for Jewish Education. He holds a doctorate in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary and is an alumnus of the Wexner Fellow Davidson Scholar Program and the Mandel Executive Leadership Institute. Dan, I invite you to turn on your video and join us. And lastly, Karen Gazith is a faculty lecturer in the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill, where she has taught for more than 2 decades and now serves as graduate program director for the university's Certificate of Inclusive Education and the ECP liaison for the Office of First Nations and Inuit Education. From 2018 to 2020, she served as academic project leader for the McGill University Faculty of Education's initiative determining best practice for students with learning challenges in Quebec, comprehensive review, and knowledge mobilization. She's also the director of the Bronfman Jewish Education Center, a Fédération CGA in Montreal, which supports 13 elementary and high schools and has won numerous community and provincial awards for teaching excellence. Karen, I invite you to turn on your video there. Okay, so all 4 of us are here. So I'd like to begin with a question about the volume's origins, why it came to be, and what compelled the 3 of you as scholars and practitioners studying and working in the field to sign on when you did. Why agree to edit a volume on Jewish education in Canada? And I'll add a second part to this question based on something you raised in your introduction to the volume, in which Kalman already mentioned, which is that the context in which the volume was conceived and which it was published, in which you wrote your introduction, are very different. The volume, of course, came out after October 7th, 2023. Different world for Canadian and global Jewry, and a very different world for Jewish educators. So as you were conceiving the introduction, pondering ways to frame the volume, what impact or bearing did our post October 7th context have on your thinking?
I guess I'm happy to start. It started with a phone call from Dan asking me to join the team. The reason I immediately said yes is my passion for Jewish education and the critical role that Jewish education plays in the future of our community in Canada. The second part of your question is post-October 7th. We started this, I would say, probably at least about 6 months prior to October 7th, when the 3 of us spoke and really sat down to think about what we wanted to say. So much had changed, and we really looked at it within the lens of October 7th. Jewish education has changed. I think we have done a wonderful job up to October 7th, but I'm sure as we'll get into, there's so many elements of Jewish education that we have to strengthen for our young people. And I think the journal really sort of sheds light on some of the areas that we need to explore and delve more closely into post October 7th.
Dan or Laura, do you want to jump in?
I'll jump in first and say I think much of the thanks for this volume and the special volume actually goes to the CJS, the Canadian Jewish Studies, who said we need to have a special edition that focuses on education and realizes the centrality of Jewish education to the Jewish experience in Canada, which I think is true. And I think is an important symbol about what Canadian Jewry means and what is supporting Canadian Jewry and what is driving it forward. And I would almost say like the challenge to the journal now that I would propose is like, okay, so when's the next one? Should this be every 3 years? Should this be every 5 years? Like, what does it mean to come back to a regular cycle to think about education not just being a special edition, but being like a regular special edition, in addition to articles in the normal run of the journal, because I believe it's really quite important. And I feel very fortunate that you, Josh, and David, and others asked if we would edit this and be helpful in helping to propel that forward. So I think that's really important. I also believe it's important because educational practice has to be driven by research. And this provides a forum for us to celebrate, bring to the fore the research that is happening, and hopefully encourage future research that is both for the purpose of research and for the purposes of propelling practice going forward. And I think as we read many of these articles, one of the things I want us to keep in the back of our mind is, and so what? And where from here, right? Like as we think about Hebrew language or music education or listening, how does that inform and how can that inform our practice as educators in the very many settings of education, formal, informal, experiential, and others that we see across this country? And of course, let me say something about October 7th. There are some issues that will remain perennial issues. Affordability, participation, etc. And there are many issues that have changed dramatically. How we think about Israel education, how we think about civic education, the place of Jewish education in the constellation of education in Canada, and much, much more. And I think when we come back to the next special edition focused on education, however many years it is, my hope is that we actually will see some of the nascent research that's happening now be published about how education is changing post October 7th, how it needs to change, how the last year has been different than the year prior, what it meant for Israelis to land on our shore in the very early days of editing this, right? We in Toronto welcomed 198 Israelis into our Jewish elementary schools. What did that mean? What does it mean for the future of Israel education and Jewish education and so much more in formal settings and informal settings? And I think what we've seen over the last 5 years is the need for research. That could be October 7th. That could be propelled by COVID. And my hope is that we give space for that research to come to the fore, which will allow us to inform practice.
And I think I'll jump in on the tail end on the same wavelength as Dan, and I'll speak at a little bit of a pragmatic level. I think in light of October 7th, we have to look at the question of what are the baselines we need research in? What are the baselines in Jewish life competencies? Up until now in education, we've always thought of the need for deep Jewish literacy. That doesn't change, but now I think we have to be thinking of advocacy, Jewish advocacy, Israel advocacy, built into Jewish education, something that we didn't really talk about before at the schooling level. So I think that's another plus.
Okay, thanks. So there are a lot of threads here that we'll pull on in questions in a moment, but I wanted to stick with your introduction. And for those who haven't read it, it dwells on the concept of listening. the importance of listening in Jewish education and pedagogical practice, this you hold up as a thematic through line for the volume. And so, can you unpack this a bit? What do you mean by listening, and how is the concept useful for our study and understanding of Jewish education?
We're all listening hard.
Anyone can jump in.
I think when we talk about listening, I think we need to think about two things. One is, to whom are we listening, right? We're listening to the learners, we're listening to their families, we're listening to our faculty, we're also listening to the milieu in which we are operating. And again, going back to our post-October 7th trope, so much of that has changed, and the need for listening is paramount and needed more than ever. And the second piece is the posture we take when listening. It is very easy to hear, but not to listen, and to observe, but not to take note, and not to action what we are hearing and what we are listening to. And I think that is one of the key pieces in this journal, which is, especially now, it's more important for us than ever to be closely attuned to what we are hearing from our learners, from our families, from the milieu, from the ways in which we are operating, from the educators as well, and to integrate that into our practice and into the ways that we are shaping curriculum and pedagogy.
So to add to that, there's an increase in the diversity of both students and families, as you know, we'd mentioned in the first question. We have in Montreal, we have an increase in the number of students coming from the public school system. Many Israelis have come for the year, and we don't know for how long, here for at least the year. So there's increasing diversity. And the best way for us to understand, you know, I love the saying, perception is reality. Understanding what the learner is thinking is the best way for us to understand what their needs are. So we really have to do a very good job listening to what those needs are. And the second thing I would say is good education is good education, both in general and Judaic studies. And really, when we listen to the students, we are in a much better position to understand the black box, which is their brain. And the more that we listen, the better job we're going to be able to do to educate them. We're also role modeling as educators. And I think we role model the importance of listening for understanding. So as educators, I think we like to talk, we like to educate, but it really is going to be increasingly important in the future that we hone in on our skills of listening so that we will understand what the needs are.
Laura, do you want to add anything? Okay, great. Well, so I think one of the marvelous things about this volume, which I alluded to earlier, is that it brings together scholars and practitioners, and in many cases, individuals like yourselves who are scholar practitioners. So why did you feel it important to put these voices in conversation? You know, what does one have to learn from the other, and vice versa, either in a Canadian context or a more general one, and for readers, both inside and outside the field of Jewish education, broadly put, what might they draw from this mix of perspectives?
I'd probably offer that an aspect of that answer is really built into the DNA of Jewish lifelong learning, and the practices and habits of mind that are involved. Scholars are referred to in Hebrew as Talmidim Chachamim, wise learners, clever students. In other words, there's never any end to the learning, whether you are an academic or a frontline practitioner. We all, whether we're academics in an academy, or whether we're in experiential education or in informal settings, we're all teaching people how to learn. And to build on what Karen Gazita said, part of that involves the listening. A part of that involves the listening for understanding. So I think the mix of the two is just built into the DNA of Jewish scholarship, whether it's at any level and in any milieu.
So, okay, so a couple of things. First of all, somebody was born and lived my entire life in Montreal, Jewish Montreal. We're steeped in Jewish culture and Jewish music. It's so much a part of who we are. Two other things. One is many years ago, I asked my friend, the Bells rabbi, if in a sentence, what is most important when it pertains to Jewish education? How do we get through to our students? And I loved his answer. Jewish education has to have a good geschmack, which means it has to taste good. And music and art and all of these different media really enable us to make Jewish education such that others want to learn. So that's one important thing. But the other thing that I really credit the people engaged with the journal for doing this, because there is so often a chasm between the research and the practice, and we've got to figure out how to deal with that. And I think this is one wonderful way of breaking that chasm. We have to. I love the fact that I think this is a critical journal. I think it's so important for educators to be kept abreast of the research, but we always have to think about the critical role of bringing that research to the practitioner. And this is one wonderful way of doing it. And I think we have to continue to think about other ways to make sure that we are continuously bringing that research to the practitioner.
One of the things I love about working with Laura and Karen is that we've all shared a journey that has integrated both practice and research, right? We've all taught in schools and day schools and supplementary schools. We've all worked in summer camps, and we've also all done research. And I think that integration provides a kind of language that roots our research and our reading of research within practice, often, with some of the scars that we carry from when we were teaching. But that's actually really important. And I think it's that integration that is so important and does happen a lot in education. I really believe that education is a team sport. It requires everyone, and ideally everyone, to be in conversation with one another. And my hope is that this journal provides some of those pieces of integration. It provides integration between formal and informal education. It provides integration between frontline practitioners and researchers, and allowing for that integration and allowing for those conversations to happen allows for practice to better research and research to inform practice. And it's that kind of team sport where we encourage each other and learn from each other that's really so critical.
I love what you just said, and I think that one of my favorite conversations that happens at the university in Jewish teacher education is when the undergrads, who are also teacher candidates or student teachers, get mixed up in their writing about the students and the teacher, and are they referring to themselves or their own students and whatever. And the conversation that grows out of that really very much smacks of what Dan has just talked about. And that, in a way, is an answer to your question, Josh. Teams.
And let's just name that. I shut the door because talking about integration, my kids came home and started making noise. So, keep those kids, keep the learners out of here. But one of the notable differences between Canada and, to some degree, Commonwealth countries in America is that teacher education happens on the undergraduate level here in Canada. And in America, it happens on in graduate school. And that is a big difference in terms of the integration of research and practitioner research and practice. And one of the things that we know we need to do more of is cultivate research so that more of our teachers and more of our educators, if they've had pre-service training or not, are able to undertake research in order to inform their practice and in order to inform the practice of others. And this is one of the challenges and one of the opportunities of operating our teacher training on the undergraduate level.
Great. So this segues nicely into my next question. So if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. This volume, I think, is the first sort of wide-ranging interdisciplinary academic treatment of Jewish education in Canada, right? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the field itself as it stands. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And as you've already sort of alluded to, in what ways can this volume sort of push the field forward? In what ways can, as Dan suggests, sequels to this volume push the field forward?
So allow me to offer two. One is we need more educators in this country, right? We have a shortage of camp counselors and camp directors and supplementary school teachers and day school teachers and principals and heads of school, and we need more. And my hope is that by elevating the field and by seeing it as a career, and by this being one more tool we have to demonstrate that there's a profession here, we can help elevate the field and say that this is a place where you can go to create your career path and hopefully recruit more top-tier educators into the field. That is one, and this has to be one arrow in the quiver of what it means to create the kind of career pathing we need in Jewish education, but it is critical work because our kids are dependent on it. Number two is, at the same time as just creating more educators, I think reflective practice and the research that comes along with that is really important. And providing the forums for people to write and reflect and to share and to be profiled is really important. I feel one of the wonderful things about this edition is the mix of authors from different ages and stages in life and in their career. And we need to be encouraging both the emerging scholars and the reflective scholars, let's say, both those who are thinking about where they want their practice to go and those who are reflecting on where their practice has been through their career, because I think we need more and more scholarship, both in order to create the career ladder and in order to inform practice.
Great. Karen or Laura?
So a couple of thoughts. In the field of education in general, there's been a renaissance in terms of educational research with a great focus on evidence, what works. And I would love to see more research in terms of evidence-based practice. What is it that we do in Jewish education that research is showing works for kids? And of course, we have to determine what our end goal is and then work backward and say, well, what is it that we're after? And how do we get there in the most evidence-based way? The other thing is I love the concept of action research. There's so much great research and so much great work happening, but after the fact, you forget how you got there at the beginning. So while we're doing these amazing things in our elementary, high school, and university environments, let's document them to see what it is that we did, what worked, and what we should do more of. I love the fact anytime anything has a Canadian in it, I love it. We're unique. And we should do more of, especially as it pertains to Jewish education. We are unique in Canada. So I think having a journal for Canadian Jewish research is really important. And finally, it just overall professionalizes, like I said, in terms of evidence-based practice. I think the journal goes a very long way towards professionalizing the field of Jewish education, which hopefully will respond to what Dan just mentioned, which is a real dearth of Jewish educators that we really need to tackle.
I think I'd like to see some of the future directions work two ways. One is to keep the doors wide open to people who would like to share their research with us, because by issuing an open invitation, we got a variety of fields and interests. I think that's important on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we also need to be a bit more planful as we go forward in terms of areas to pursue. One thing that interests me greatly is the variety of models that are taken in the schools and the field in general towards Hebrew language learning, and those schools who count on it and want it, those schools who like it as an also ran, those schools and arenas who make use of Hebrew in different ways. I think we have the beginnings with Adi Bar-El's article of some really good action research there, and I think that we could now structure some invitations towards more research in that area, for example, and in many others that we opened up. So I'd like to see that bipartite approach.
Well, so I want to pick up on something that that Karen said and ask it of the group. What makes Canada unique in the Jewish education space? Dare I ask, what makes Montreal unique, or what makes Toronto unique? And we can add other Canadian cities to the mix. But how would you begin to answer that?
So I could say in Montreal, which again I think is similar across Canada, but of course every province and every city has its own uniqueness. But Montreal Jews are steeped in their tradition. It's an old community. The first Jew came hundreds of years ago, but we're very much steeped in tradition. We have non-religious Jews going to religious synagogues. We don't cut ourselves against the same lines, I think, that you tend to see in the States. When people say to us, are you pluralistic? Are you community? We tend not to label ourselves in the same way. I think more Canadian Jews see themselves in a more traditional light. And just general pride in Canada as a Jewish Canadian. So
I think education in Canada, Jewish education in Canada, is a really interesting hybrid between the roots which we draw from, often Commonwealth countries, but not only Commonwealth countries, increasingly Jewish education in the FSU in Israel, but like the roots where we, our parents, our grandparents, like a short history come from, and the influence of our American cousins to the south, which of course is like, the behemoth, which informs, because of our networks, what curriculum looks like, what pedagogy looks like, where our teachers come from often, and things like that. And it's that hybrid of our roots with a relatively short history here and the American influences that I think shape Canadian Jewish education. I think, of course, it's informed by what Bob Grimm and Rod DeLenton and others in the 2018 survey of Canadian Jews would call Canadian exceptionalism. The things that make us different include very high participation rates, traditionalism, deep affiliation, an assumed and deep relationship, an ongoing relationship with Israel, which informs what the pedagogy is. So I think there are probably two pieces there. One is, who is the learner? And what homes are they growing up in? Are they, the influence of their parents and grandparents, which are often very local, especially compared to Americans who are much more transient. And two is the milieu in which we're growing up, a milieu that favors multiculturalism, where polishing our stone on the cultural mosaic of Canada is important and cherished and valued, which does set us apart from America. And I think it's those two things, the learner and the milieu, and our deep roots outside of Canada also, that inform what education looks like here.
And I'll throw in a sort of unpopular piece because of the attitude toward multiculturalism. This is the flip side. It's very easy for a lot of Jewish potential learners for Jewish education to hide in plain sight. There are a lot of mildly affiliated or not affiliated Jewish learners out there. There are groups that we need to bring in so many different ways, and I think research needs to be done on how. There are some PhDs in progress, for example, about how people connect with their Jewish community. It may not be formal education, or it may be through a textile guild, it may be through the arts, it may be through, a Friday dinner group, it may be whatever. But I think that we need to open our eyes very wide and do some research about embracing and bringing those groups closer, and thinking about education very broadly in order to include and keep people involved.
Okay, thank you. So a final question before we move on to the next part of the program. You write at the very end of your introduction very movingly about your mentor, the late York University scholar, a lion of Canadian Jewish studies, Michael Brown. And so I'm wondering if each of you can speak about his influence on your work and practice and why you felt it was important to dedicate the volume to his memory.
I can talk from the teenage perspective. Michael Brown was my teacher for tefillah, liturgy, prayer, etc., in a summer camp setting where I was learning to. I was a Madornik at the Camp Ramah site in the States, and there was something about Michael Brown's depth in learning, and yet his ability to not take himself so seriously. There was something about learning to deliver a Dvar Torah or a lesson in liturgy to teenage campers. Well, I myself wasn't feeling so sure about my knowledge, but yet, approaching it in flip-flops. There was something about that very approachable human mixture that was very important. And then back in Toronto, Michael Brown was the first person to welcome all those, counselors in training or whatever we were, into his home and cook with us. And it was all a guise for Jewish education on the hoof. And I think there's something very human about that and very approachable about that. And very, very compelling. And then, of course, I saw him as a colleague at the academy, teaching in a much more formal light, and saw the influence that he's had on people's learning. So I value that, and I value his sense of humor just in public. And yes, a lion. You're absolutely right.
I think for me, Michael was able to demonstrate an integration of Jewish studies, of an understanding of community, and of education. And our conversations would wind through those things, right? In one conversation, we could speak about, the history of the prayer for the government and what was happening in Tsarist Russia. And in the same conversation, talk about like the challenges facing the Jewish community of the day. And in the same conversation, talk about my practice as a teacher. And I think his ability to weave through those different areas with incredible comfort and incredible knowledge was remarkable. But I also think I learned from him that education isn't just about the classroom, or in Laura's case, the summer camp. We used to get together in his home and sip tea for hours to talk about these things, because he saw his job as being a mentor. He saw his job as being someone who could coach, could develop, could challenge, could push, could find lots and lots of spelling mistakes, but who could really make sure that we are thinking about our roles in community, not in any one of those silos, but how they integrated. And saw his job not just as like pushing us to produce the best paper, but pushing us to produce the best community.
Okay, well, great. So thank you, Laura, Dan, Karen. We'll come back at the end. Hopefully we'll have more discussion around these themes and more. But now we're going to move to the next part of the program, where you'll hear from 8 of the volume's contributors, each speaking briefly about their pieces. And so we have contributors from our section of peer-reviewed articles, our roundtable section, our archives feature, and our section of personal scholarly reflections. And so we're going to go in the order in which they appear in the volume. And if you're so inclined, I encourage you to follow along on our website. It's been posted in the chat, cjs.journals.yorku.ca. And just a reminder, you can submit questions or comments for our special editors, anything to do with the conversation we just had, or more, or any of the contributors by using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So how this will work is to our contributors, I'll call out your name, open your video, unmute, and we'll go from there. So we'll begin with Seth Gorin, who is Hillel Ontario's Chief Executive Officer and a PhD candidate in curriculum and pedagogy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, the University of Toronto. He's also a lawyer with a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a rabbi with ordination from Hebrew Union College. Seth.
Thanks so much, Josh. So my article is titled Towards a Contemporary Canadian Jewish Pedagogy of Listening. In spite of the fact that listening forms a dominant portion of human communication, there has been limited research on listening, minimal investigation into the teaching of listening, and even less consideration of the teaching of listening in Jewish or Canadian spaces specifically. In the face of this relatively empty academic space, it is possible to construct a pedagogy of listening grounded in Canadian Jewish experiences, one that can inform the broader field of listening in significant ways. This article proposes a contemporary Jewish pedagogy, a Canadian Jewish pedagogy of listening grounded in Jewish Canadian experiences and identities, focusing on 3 areas and pursuing 3 aims. First, healing from trauma, particularly the role of listening and feeling heard in the healing process, and what it means for listeners to make room for other perspectives, whether trauma-based or not, even as they themselves are experiencing or are inheritors of trauma. Number 2, amplifying diverse perspectives in the context of multiculturalism, drawing from a multivocalic tradition, chavruta, or paired text study as a structure for listening and learning, and Jewish listening preferences and styles as marginalized practices. And 3, advancing reconciliation, including how approaches can be informed by Indigenous Canadian Jewish encounters and Jewish models for teshuvah, repentance. So in essence, the 3 are healing from trauma, amplifying diverse perspectives in the context of multiculturalism, and advancing reconciliation. Developing and implementing a Canadian Jewish pedagogy of listening that incorporates these 3 aspects could equip teachers, students, and their communities to better thrive in challenging environments, engage across differences, and ease pervasive and growing feelings of isolation and loneliness. Moreover, doing so brings with it the potential to make a substantial impact beyond the Jewish Canadian community, both nationally and in the field of listening as a whole, at a time of rising disagreement, adversity, and friction. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Seth. Next up, Miriam Borden is a doctoral candidate in the Yiddish stream at the Department of German Languages and Literatures at the University of Toronto, where she researches post-Holocaust Yiddish culture. Miriam.
Hi, thank you so much. So my article is titled Joshua King David and the Flying Nun, Doodles and Reader Annotations in Post-Holocaust Yiddish Primers for Children, or Primers for Children. So essentially, the context for looking at Yiddish primers is that Yiddish schools basically took considerable effort to run and to maintain, especially after the Holocaust, and especially in North American cities like Toronto, which is where my article is focused, where a new generation of Canadian-born children were not necessarily learning Yiddish at home. And this is more and more the case as, sorry, I'm turning down Toy Story in the background for my toddler. This is more and more the case as in the post-war years. And in addition, I mean, we don't have lots of fond memories of what it was like to be in these Yiddish shulas, these Yiddish schools. They were supplementary schools, which meant that students were often attending them, were always attending them, in fact, after the long school day had ended. They kind of wanted to be anywhere else. And this is what you get anecdotally from people. We don't really have a lot of quantitative evidence, though, of their experience there. And that's what I tried to find in their old school books. So my article looks at children's primers. These are books that taught young readers how to read and write Yiddish. And they used various approaches. These are usually narrative books. If you've seen primers from the 20th century, you're familiar with the format, basically. These adhere to that. There's always kind of a loose plot. They tend to try to be fun. They rarely succeed. I was less interested in the ideology, the language pedagogy that contained in the pages of these books than I was actually in the annotations that students left in the margins of their books. So these are doodles. Sometimes they're simply decorative, sometimes they're insightful, and many of them are quite subversive, actually. Dan and Karen mentioned listening to the learners. In fact, everybody mentioned listening to the learners, and that's exactly what my article attempts to do. One finding that I discovered was that these books pair Yiddish language and Yiddishkeit together, which is, the language informs one's sense of identity and vice versa. And at first glance, it looks like the kids using these books had no sense of that relationship. But what I found was that kids did have a sense of that relationship. They had a sense of Yiddishkeit. It just wasn't the same sense that their parents and teachers had. It wasn't necessarily coming from the Yiddish language itself. It was coming from somewhere else. What surprised me in this research was just how deeply these kids internalized the Yiddishkeit of their forebears in these other ways, in these surprising ways, even in ways that their own parents and teachers wouldn't recognize. With doodles about personal hygiene, like deodorant and shaving cream, and even the flying nun. Reading these books for more than what's printed in them allows us to trace their circulation, allows us to see how they traveled among students and what impressions the students left on them as well. Because what I found is that nearly every kid who inherited a book from another kid took the opportunity to scribble in the margins of the book, sign their names, sometimes their home addresses, and sometimes rather cheeky messages to one another or just to no one in particular. And I think, sure, all students doodle in their school books. This is not unique to students in Yiddish schools, but what's distinctive about these doodles is the way that they respond, or in some cases don't respond at all, to the content on the page. And that is that the doodles are themselves in English, while the content of the books are, of course, in Yiddish. These kids were encountering the language and culture in this rapidly changing environment where the role, the impact, and certainly the future of Yiddish was becoming less and less clear. This is the beginning of what I hope will be a larger project on the history of Yiddish education across Canada. This is the first step, and it's really a bottom-up approach that really begins with the students. And I'll just say that, research on post-war Yiddish broadly really has yet to blossom. Yiddish reading material for children, research on that is in its infancy. It is happening, but it's just beginning. We know a little bit about Yiddish primers. We have some histories of Yiddish education. Okay, just a minute. We even have a good history on Yiddish periodicals produced by various Yiddish school systems, but we don't know in a qualitative way is how children received this material, how they handled Yiddish language as it landed in front of them, landed in their laps, often laden with history, memory, in many cases the trauma of their parents who survived the war. And here is where I hope my research has made a very small contribution. And just a plug for the upcoming Association for Canadian Jewish Studies podcast, I talk in much more depth about my article in the first episode, I believe, which is coming out soon. Maybe Josh can talk more about that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Miriam. And since we're talking about marginal notes, I'll just add in the margins that Miriam's contribution is perhaps the most vulgar that that Canadian Jewish Studies has ever published. So I encourage you to read it for that and many other reasons. Thanks, Miriam. Next up, we have Matt Reingold. Matt is a scholar of Israeli comics and cartoons and a researcher of best practices in Israel education. Matt.
Thanks so much, Josh. I want to first express my Hakrat Tov to Laura, Dan, Karen for publishing this very important issue, and to David and Kalman and Josh and the rest of the CJS team for recognizing the importance of talking about Canadian Jewish education. Like Dan said before, I too am hopeful that this issue will be really the beginning, not the end, of a bigger process of studying the ways that Jewish education is done in Canada and part of comparative studies of Jewish education more broadly. So my article's titled Easier to Understand but More Difficult to Digest: Student Experiences with Israeli Yom HaZikaron Cartoons. And it emerged out of two separate areas of interest for me. One is Israeli political cartoons, something that I've been writing about over the last number of years. And number two, studying about best practices in Israel education, especially how Israel can be taught and learned through the arts. And this was the first of 3 articles based on a study that I conducted of qualitative research examining the ways that secondary school students learned about Israel through political cartoons. And the research tells us that commemoration of Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Remembrance Day, has received considerable attention. But all of the research that's been published about how youth understand and think about Yom HaZikaron has been focused on Israel, the way that Israeli kids, teens, young adults experience the day. There's been no comparable data published about how diaspora Jews, Canada, America, anywhere else, think about, experience the commemoration ceremonies that go on in their own communities. My article draws upon two research methodologies, qualitative and arts-based research, in order to study how participating in a gallery walk of Israeli political cartoons provided students with new ways of thinking about and relating to Yom HaZikaron. The students involved were a cohort of Canadian Jewish teens at a Jewish secondary school, and they had all experienced multiple years of Yom HaZikaron commemoration ceremonies. For some, this was their 12th year doing Yom HaZikaron ceremonies. And at the start of the year, I spoke with them about what are their attitudes towards Yom HaZikaron, and they shared that though they cared deeply about Yom HaZikaron, the day itself felt alien, foreign, because they had a hard time forming a connection to the day. Many shared that they didn't know anyone who had died or suffered as part of Yom HaZikaron or who was being commemorated. They didn't know soldiers who had been serving in the IDF or who had been wounded. And so though the day was important, it was a day that was difficult for them to relate to. As a result of studying through political cartoons and seeing examples of how Israelis themselves illustrated, drew, wrote about their experiences in very personal ways, the study revealed that the cartoons allow students to form new emotional connections to the day and the Israeli experience of Yom HaZikaron, because the texts afforded students a space to arrive at their own personal understandings. The nature of political cartoons is such that there is an interpretive process, and the opportunity to go through that process of thinking about what they are seeing, recognizing the layers of symbolism and intertextuality and contextuality, allowed them to arrive at their own understanding. And that became a very meaningful and personal way for them to think about Yom HaZikaron. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Matt. Before we go on, just a reminder, you can use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to ask questions, which we'll include in discussion at the end of the program. But moving on to our next contributors, we have a co-author pair, Sarah R. Horowitz and Anna Vyprinska. Sarah Horowitz is a professor of comparative literature and humanities and the former director of the Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York. She is the author of many books, journals, and essays, and in 2022 received the Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies from the Holocaust Education Foundation at Northwestern University. And Anna is a poet, scholar of Holocaust memory, and an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Calgary. Sarah and Anna.
Okay, well, I'm going to open up by talking a little bit about the article. The article is a forum. That's a format. A forum is where people reflect on several issues and share their thoughts. And the name of the forum is Learning from the Past, Teaching for the Future. And the title of the forum takes its name from a unique program that the forum is focusing on. So I feel like our piece in this issue is a bit of an outlier in the sense that we are not talking about educating Jewish children or Jewish adults. We're really talking about educating a broad range of students about something that is, of course, very important to Jewish history, the Holocaust, but really talking about the Holocaust in a broad context, in the context of learning about the Holocaust as a way to think about anti-Semitism, but also anti-racism and other kinds of prejudices and atrocities and genocides and terrible things happening in the world, obviously with the idea that it's something we think that education, or we hope, can mitigate against. So the program Learning from the Past, Teaching from the Future, was the brainchild of my colleagues at York, Mark Weber and Michael Brown, Zichrono Livracha, and I joined them in this, and we developed a program that brings together Canadian, Polish, and German students to learn about the Holocaust, what happened, and how it's thought about and memorialized and taught in North America, but also in Poland and in Germany, and to think about the ways in which people contend with this past and hopefully learn from it. The idea was that we would look at people, we would ask people who participated in this program as students a decade ago and ask them to reflect on what the experience was like for them at the time, but also, did it have an impact on them? Did it affect them? 10 years later, look back and discuss it. And I thought, I would like to do this in partnership with Anna Vaprinska, because Anna was a participant in the program 10 years ago, and now she's a professor, my colleague really, at Calgary, a really valued colleague. And I thought together we would really be able to come up with a way of focusing on issues that would provide a context that the participants in the forum could really meaningfully reflect on.
Sarah, thank you for that. I'm going to jump in first. I'm really honored to be a part of this issue. Thank you to the other editors and guest editors, and thank you to Sarah for asking me to work on this forum with her. Yes, I was an editor and a participant, which was a very interesting experience because I was both editing the other participants' responses, but also responding myself. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the other participants, Anna Flegg, David Gort, Marika Peach, and Maxa Sawyer. It's a combination of students, what used to be students from Germany and from Canada. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this very short interval is the long-term impact of this program, as well as the educational component of the program. A program like this, I think, really haunts you, and it has many afterlives. And one of the things we saw in the responses from the participants is really how much the program affected the course of their lives, whether it was career choices or whether it was like other commitments to the Holocaust education in some way. So I found that really interesting because it is something that has been really pivotal in my own life and in my own career trajectory. And the forum itself also felt like a conversation, not just a forum. It felt almost like a reunion of really people who had become friends. And the questions they cover, as Sarah mentioned, long-term impacts, also our relationship to the past and the present, thinking about the challenging aspects of the program. And then what I wanted to say about education is the program was really interesting because not only was it an embodied kind of learning that took us to these sites of Holocaust memory in Germany and Poland, and there was also a Canadian component of the program, but also there was this embodied kind of relationship to each other and learning to witness each other's reactions when we would enter camps or museums, etc. And so that kind of interpersonal relationship also became part of the education. And if I have maybe another minute or 30 seconds, I don't know, Josh, if I do.
No, please.
I just wanted to read like a very short quote from the afterword I wrote for this because it's on education and this issue is about education. So it reads, experiential education, which is at the heart of this program, allows us to embody our learning, to learn with the whole body. Perhaps that's part of the reason it's hard to forget a program like TFTF. Teaching for the future. Experiential education is also unruly. Educators don't fully know how it will play out. The dynamic of the group, the long hours, the physical, emotional, and mental limitations of each human body. And in this way, experiential learning is education at its best, unpredictable, full of new awakenings. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Sarah. Okay. Next up, we have Janice Rosen. And Janice is the Archives Director of the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives in Montreal, and she edits the Archives Matter section of Canadian Jewish Studies. Janice.
Hi. The Archives Matters section is designed to provide primary source illustrations of materials on a particular theme, usually a theme linked to that of the volume in which it appears. The aim is to stimulate research at various archival repositories using hitherto little-known materials or materials that warrant study from new perspectives. This is the 10th appearance of the Archives Matters section in the Canadian Jewish Studies Journal, and there were 3 articles in this installment. In her article titled Hebrew School Studies in St. John, 1898 to 2015, Catherine Biggs-Craft of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum approaches the issue of education through the lens of the teaching of Hebrew and Jewish values. Her citations and illustrations from the archival records show how these classes were arranged and conducted in St. John, New Brunswick between 1898 and 2015. The article evokes the challenges faced by a smaller community determined to keep Jewish religion and Jewish cultural identity alive despite the pull of assimilation. For composer David Botwinick, pedagogy was more than a day job. The contribution from the Jewish Public Library Archives focuses on the life and career of David Botwinick, a longtime music teacher at the United Talmud-Torahs in Montreal. Maya Pasternak, director of the Jewish Public Library Archives, coordinated the input of co-authors Molly Newman and Shlomo Jack Enkin-Lewis, interns from the BA program in Jewish Studies at McGill University, and Dina Malka Botwinick, archives intern from the Master of Library Sciences program at Pennsylvania Western University. The article's introduction notes that while it is common to hear about language policy debates between English and French in Montreal, the JPL phones related to education highlight a parallel tension between Yiddish and Hebrew dominance. UTT, founded in 1896 with Yiddish language instruction, shifted to Hebrew instruction in 1917. Maya comments that Botwinick himself weighs into the discourse as a steadfast proponent of Yiddish language instruction in Jewish educational settings. And the article is enhanced by several images of documents from the David Botwinick collection at the JPLA. Lastly, well, it's first in the section, but lastly in my comments, in the article I contributed to this section, broadly titled Documenting the Education of Jewish Children in Quebec and Canada, most of the collections which I illustrate have been the subject of some prior study. These subjects include the Canadian Jewish Congress involvement in questions surrounding the legal status of Jews within the general education system of Quebec, and the historical developments which led to the creation of Jewish-run schools at various points in time and in various places. The documents and photographs which illustrate the article were chosen for their evocative power, as a close study of each of them can stimulate further questions and directions for future research. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Janice. Now I'd like to invite back Laura Wiseman, who we've already met. Laura did double duty as editor and contributor, and she'll be speaking about an article she co-authored with the historian and day school educator Jack Lipinski, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us. Laura.
Thank you very much. So Jack sends his regards. He's sorry he wasn't able to come, and that all that means is I'm winging this. Jack really is the historian and would be able to tell you about how United Synagogue Day School under the supervision of Dr. Aaron Nussbaum grew as part and parcel of Beth Tzedek, but really it was predicated on the foundation school that Beth Tzedek kind of housed. It was meant to be a foundation school for children from nursery up to grade 3 to get a really good, strong foundation in Hebrew language and literature and general schooling. And after that, they were supposed to continue on in their public schools for the rest of their learning careers. With the request of parents, etc., the school actually continued on in a day school fashion. And ultimately became the largest Solomon Schechter school in the North American network. At its heyday, it had 3 campuses and 1,450 students. So this is a large feather. I guess we don't say that anymore. This is really to the pride of Dr. Nussbaum. Because when he came to Toronto, the only Hebrew day school game in town was called Talmud Torah. It has morphed over the years into Associated Hebrew Schools. And in those days, Talmud Torah privileged the Jewish studies and the Hebrew. And the general studies were somewhat of an also-ran, although they taught the Ontario curriculum, they hired retired teachers, etc. And Dr. Nussbaum was determined to make the status of both general studies and what he called Hebrew studies, Jewish studies. He was determined to have them be on a parallel footing. I'll just back up for a second and say that in the reflections section of the journal, there are reflections of 2 leading Toronto Jewish educators, both academics in their own right. We're going to hear from one shortly. He is Dr. Seymour Epstein, who was former head of the Board of Jewish Education inter alia, and you'll hear from Epi directly about his career and what he's learned both as educator and student. The reflection that I'm supposed to be concentrating on is the one with Dr. Nussbaum. As I said, both these people are academics in their own right with PhDs in Dr. Nussbaum's is in history, Jewish history and education, and of course a teacher. He's a teacher par excellence, and most lately a teacher of teachers. Both educators are my personal 2 of my personal mentors. So I think you've heard over the course of this short webinar that I have been very privileged to have been to have had the tutelage of Michael Brown and Seymour Epstein and Aaron Nussbaum. Both the people in the reflections section are proponents of deep Jewish literacy and very encouraging of all learners, whether they're teachers or students themselves. Dr. Nussbaum brought a kind of education to Toronto that changed attitudes towards breadth and depth of learning, of Jewish learning, for example. I think I will highlight 3 tenets of his teachings. And for the school, he prized curriculum integration, complementary education. He placed general studies and Jewish studies on an equal footing. They were both considered important, and he was a proponent of curriculum integration, of teaching them together where possible, well before that became the fashion in the professional development world. It was very clear to him that we don't have a Jewish half and a general half, that underneath our scalps is all of us, a whole person. And that's the kind of education he valued, education that forwarded both. He is a proponent of critical analytical thinking. In the Jewish studies, there are many texts that underpin our tradition, and rather than push for a race to cover breadth, he was far more interested in teaching the teachers to help the students develop depth, to learn things well, to raise questions, to ask about things that interested them, and to follow those interests. And he was successful in this, I think. And the third tenet, I think, that sticks out is Dr. Nussbaum's respect for the dignity of all children. He refused to have streamed classes academically. There was an exercise done every year to balance classes in the different kinds of learners and identities of students, so that there would be heterogeneous classes for the sake of children's dignity. He practices what he preaches in his private life also, in terms of learning and promoting learning. He studies with his sons-in-law, he studies with his children, he studies with his grandchildren. He particularly likes to supplement where he perceives holes. So some of his granddaughters and great-granddaughters, for example, he thinks they need more Bible books, more general Bible books in their life. So he studies with them, teaches them the book of Ruth before their bat mitzvah, teaches them all kinds of things. And in one of the anecdotes he told to Jack Lipinski and myself when we were visiting, occasions with lots of laughter and ruglach, one of the anecdotes he told us was that he was kibitzing with his granddaughter when his daughter picked her up. Maybe it was a great granddaughter. I might be skipping a generation. And in any case, the child's mother said, are you enjoying yourself? Did you have a good time? And the answer was yes. And the mother asked, what is it that you liked about what you did today? And she shot back, the daughter shot back, Saba allows questions. And it just hit me then, speaking of listening, thank you, Seth Goran, it just hit me then that there are schools still in this day and age that where certain questions are not asked or maybe not permitted. And if something typifies Aaron Nussbaum, it is the asking of questions and the promoting of good questions. Jewish educators always have this line. When kids come home from school, you don't say, what did you learn today? Because the answer to that, as we all know, is nothing. The question you're supposed to ask is, did you ask a good question today? And that's Dr. Nussbaum. He promotes that kind of thinking and that kind of depth. And I think that he takes an attitude that Karen Gazit talked about very early in this conversation, that learning should be pleasant. Learning should be made pleasant for all learners. He tells it in the model of a Hasidic story, but it applies all across the board. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Laura. And as Laura mentioned, the second contributor to our reflection section is Seymour Epstein, widely known as Epi. And Epi is one of our leading thinkers on Jewish education and pedagogy. In his long career, he has served as World Director of Jewish Education for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and Director of Toronto's Board of Jewish Education, among other roles. Epi.
Hi. The title of my piece is When Learning Moments Become Teaching Moments, Reflections from a Canadian Jewish Educator. Look, I'm the senior citizen of the gang, and it was, I think, fitting that I would do a memoir of my career. When I was offered this opportunity by Dan and by Laura, I at first wasn't quite sure, but then got into it and realized that there was something I had already written that could contribute to this once I expanded the whole thing. And that was a memoir of my 1965-66 student year at Mechon Greenberg and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It was an amazing experience, and I detail it in the essay. In a brief encounter like this, if I tell you that my poetry teacher was Yehuda Michai, my prose teacher was Aaron Appelfeld, one of my Bible teachers was Nechama Leibovitz that year, it was the very best of Jerusalem pedagogy offered to us in this really wonderful program. What I did was I decided to see where those moments of learning influenced my moments of teaching later in life. And illustrated throughout the essay just how that came to be. I'll only say that the experience for me in writing it was worthwhile. It brought back wonderful memories, but it also brought together strands of my career that I had begun to forget. And it was wonderful to bring them back into memory and to see the connection between those wonderful moments in Jerusalem many, many years ago and those various places in my career where those moments had a great influence. I ended the essay by quoting one of my mentors, Professor Joseph Lukinsky, Zichrono Livracha, rabbi, professor, great baseball player. I said of him that he never taught. What he did was he learned in front of his students. And with that, we learned sort of both how to learn and how to teach at one and the same time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Epi, and thank you to all our contributors. If you haven't noticed, David Kaufman has been posting links to all of the articles in the chat, so you can go to individual pieces directly, and there's a link earlier in the chat for the entire table of contents. And if you're interested, we sell print order copies of the journal on Amazon.ca, and there's a link to do so on our website. But now I'd like to open things up to Q&A and discussion. So I invite everyone to come back on screen, our special editors and our contributors. For those in the audience, again, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in your questions or comments. And for the special editors and contributors, I invite you too to ask questions of one another and continue the discussion we've been having over the past hour and change.
Can I ask a question of our contributors?
Sorry?
Can I ask a question of our contributors?
Yes, please.
I'm curious, coming from very different places in the educational spheres, what you see as the greatest opportunities and challenges that Jewish education in Canada will face in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Okay, so those who are brave enough to prognosticate, you can unmute yourselves and go for it.
I'm willing to say something. I guess I get my picture back on my real face. God. I think we've done it. The journal has done a great job of analysis of what exists and the quality of some of the pedagogy that exists and some new trends in pedagogy, stress on listening, all kinds of interesting things. But it doesn't seem to deal with the people we're missing. We are missing a lot of people, and we're not. There was this question of what's unique in Canadian Jewish education. Unique is the fact that our percentages are higher in Canada than they are in some other diaspora communities, most especially the large community to the south. But within our community, we're still not reaching everybody by any means, and I think more has to be done about that. But I'm also these days very concerned about adult Jewish literacy and the need for more adult Jewish education outside of the realm of schooling. And I think I wonder if others have a significant or similar thinking in this regard.
Dan, do you want to respond to Epi, or does anyone else want to chime in?
I would echo that. I think Dan also kind of hinted at that earlier in terms of what does it mean to have a pipeline of Jewish professionals who are able to serve as educators? I would add to that kind of the cost of hiring people who want to serve as Jewish educators. How do we as a community afford that, given that when we're looking at different types of Jewish professionals, and perhaps it's just my vantage point on campus, that Jewish educators are among the most expensive to hire and the most difficult to retain, especially when salaries just south of the border, even when you discount the exchange rate, are significantly higher than what we're able to afford. If we're talking about just in terms of content of Jewish education, I think in this moment when anti-Semitism is rising and is so much at the forefront of how people are thinking about Jewish identity and Jewish engagement, what does it mean to educate Jews about Jewish identity beyond anti-Semitism, beyond advocacy for aspects of Jewish identity and Jewish life that involve positive emotions, joy, pride, celebration, things that are compelling as opposed to ways of kind of pushing back against the rest of the world and the way that the rest of the world might be expressing itself against Jews.
I am wondering in what ways October 7th is going to have ripple effects on the way that Israel education is done. Is it something that is going to certainly it's going to be part of whatever future Israel education we are doing. But what I think we don't know yet is it a piece of the story, or is it going to completely redo the way that we think about Israel education? I wonder equally, as someone who has been studying for a number of years now, the importance of teaching complex stories about Israel, that with so much anti-Semitism, as I think Seth was mentioning, and the desire to create space that is safe and welcoming and nurturing for students, that responds to so much of the negativity outside, in what ways does that trickle down into how we then do Israel in nuanced, complex, thoughtful, real ways that highlight the awesomeness of Israel and also talk about ways that students might be challenged by Israel?
So I can add something. First of all, I think we've got to start going into our high schools and excite people, our students, about going into the field of Jewish education. So we have to find a way to get to them while they're thinking about what they want to be and make it so compelling for them that they want to take this path of Jewish education. In terms of where we go with education, I believe very strongly that we have to ensure that every student that graduates from Jewish day school and kids that don't go to Jewish day school are able to tell our Jewish story, so that it's not just within the lens of, the state of Israel, but going back to the beginning of time. I want every kid to be able to tell their story, get up there and speak succinctly. I didn't hear this, but just listening to so many great educators speak, we have to make sure they know that the first Zionist was Abraham, and we have to just make sure that they can speak of their story with confidence, articulately. And I think as somebody, many of us are on campus, I see daily how important that is. Whether or not they actually feel or feel comfortable enough to speak out, at least in their own heads, when confronted, they know our Jewish story and they are just passionate about our story.
I could jump in quickly as well. I have a long list when we set out to do the volume and thought about people that we might invite, in a bespoke manner to contribute, as well as sending out a wide call for papers. We brainstormed a very long list of sort of suitable subjects, most of which we didn't cover. So Dan, I appreciate the challenge and the recommendation that we do this on the regular or semi-regular. One of the things that I could list the list, but it's long and it could be far longer. So I'm absolutely certain that we could fill, an annual journal devoted to this question alone, if there were only enough contributors who are producing research about it, which there aren't. So it will have to be every couple of years. What I'm personally most interested in seeing research about is about Jewish education at the university level, what Jewish studies in the academy looks like from a Jewish education perspective. And the curious observation over the course of the 10 or so years that I've been teaching Jewish studies at the university, the shift in the demographics of the learners from, the plurality of them being Jewish students to the plurality of them being non-Jewish students. So what does it mean to be teaching, to be doing Jewish education to non-Jewish students? Now, I work in the university context. I think about this quite a bit, but I think the question about Jewish education for non-Jews is also a pretty interesting and very much untapped area of research for, learners and the spheres of education and education policy and younger learners and high school kids and all the rest. So I would love to see more on that someday.
To pick up on a thread of what Karen spoke of, I think we also need to think of different models of Jewish education for adults now. We're not all adults are equipped to speak on behalf of Israel, to take a stand on behalf of family. It was taken for granted for years. It was just taken for granted that adults would know what to say. And that's not correct either. We need to bring people, we need to parent parents.
I'd like to add that we are all from Toronto, Montreal, right? And especially as the Canadian Jewish community spreads out, and I say that in terms of the growth in Victoria, but also the growth in Barrie, Aurora, Newmarket, Halton, Peel, right? The areas around, the major hubs. That's going to change how education is delivered. That's going to change who the learners are. That's going to change lots of pieces. And we're going to have to think about what that means, right? It will be a dramatic shift in how we deliver education and the milieu in which people are learning.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks everyone. We're running up to 8:30, so I think we should bring things to a close. Thank you to our special editors, all of our contributors who were able to join us this evening. Congratulations on the volume. It's good stuff. I encourage everyone out there to seek out articles that piqued your interest, read the entire volume, and continue the conversation. Look forward to future volumes of Canadian Jewish Studies that deal with Jewish education in Canada. And so with that, I will say good night.
Good job, Josh.
Yes.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.